Hello everyone and welcome to week 6 in which we will be discussing what was arguably the most successful of all Medici rulers, Cosimo I, Cosimo the First. And known as the First because he was the first Grand Duke of Tuscany. He was the second Duke of Tuscany after Alessandro. He was given the hereditary title of Grand Duke by the Pope in 1569. But it's interesting because when Cosimo came to power in 1537, really almost no one would have imagined Cosimo's meteoric rise to power, nor would they ever have entertained the notion that one day Tuscany, united under the Medici, would become a Grand Duchy, a centralized aristocratic state that had much in common with other bureaucratizing European states in the 16th century. So let's think a little bit about where we left off last week. You could argue that between 1494 and 1530, Florence had never experienced more turmoil and political instability in its recent history. So we saw for the first time a much more democratic form of the electoral process in Florence, in the form of the Great Council. We also saw how religious passion could bring about great social and political change in the form of the person of Savonarola, and even how decades later his followers were able to overturn the Medici and bring about a new government in 1527. Moreover, Florentines in this period also enjoyed a relatively stable and relatively republican government under the guidance of Piero Soderini. But all of these republican experiments need always to be understood in the context of the Italian wars, in the continual threat of invasion and subjugation by one foreign prince or another, whether it be Francis I or Charles V, or even a sort of crusading pope. Enemies were perpetually at Florence's doorstep. Between 1530 and 1536, the city also had to suffer the humiliating and ultimately embarrassing rule of Alessandro de' Medici, who was installed as Duke of Florence by Charles V, and who, much like Lorenzo II and Piero the Unfortunate, began to rule as a sort of petty tyrant, flouting the city's republican traditions and letting a small council take care of the business of running a city, thus offending the Ottimati and really offending everyone else. In his terrible behavior, he was often stumbling from one brothel to the next across the city, and ultimately got himself killed by his cousin Lorenzaccio. So thus far, leading up to 1536, with ineffectual rulers, with family members murdering one another, and with Medici popes driving Europe to religious revolution, it didn't seem like the Medici family would ever be capable of ruling Florence for any period of time with great success. Yet, though they had their enemies, they also had their supporters. The Paleschi, the supporters of the Medici, still had powerful connections with Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and within the city of Florence and across the province of Tuscany, they maintained a network of amici, of friends, who were either on the Medici payroll or had other reasons to support the return of the Medici to power in Florence. For example, if they were exiles who were wishing to return to the city, or if they had common enemies with the Medici, for example, the Strozzi family, who at the very outset of Cosimo's rule presented a considerable threat to his power. So, how does one take a city republic that's falling to pieces and turn it into a smooth-running principato, a princedom, or dukedom rather? But this period of Tuscan history is known as the Mediceo Principato, the Medicean Principate. Well, Cosimo was extremely young when he came to power, about 17, 18 years old, and he had spent nearly all his life growing up in the Tuscan countryside, where he was an avid hunter and relatively good student for his tutors. His father was the irascible, bellicose Giovanni dalle Bandinere. He's a military man, often away campaigning in the Italian wars, where he eventually is shot, one of his legs, and it becomes infected, he gets this fever and dies. There's actually a very interesting movie made about the last days of his life and the Italian wars, which I have posted on the website. So I encourage you to check that out. Also because it features one of Italy's most classic and well-known actors, Vittorio Gassman, who's really a delight to watch. Anyway, so Giovanni delle Bandinere is his father, and Cosimo himself is born in Florence, in the palazzo of his mother's family, the Salviati. So there's a story, actually, that one day when Cosimo was just an infant, his father rode into town, and from the pavement below the palazzo, he starts yelling up at his son's nursery maid that he wants to see the boy, and that she should throw him down to him. So the nurse, who's understandably nervous about doing that, finally is forced to comply. She doesn't have much choice, so she tosses Cosimo down to his father below, where Giovanni luckily catches him. And it's said that he said, yes, you'll be a prince someday. So it's likely apocryphal. And it's very, it's likely this story never happened. But the fact that this popular story was widely circulated gives you some sense of the kind of family we're dealing with here. So practically from birth, Cosimo was destined to lead a tumultuous and notable life. So again, Cosimo's father died when he was just a boy, leaving his mother to raise him. She, Maria Salviati, was the niece of a pope and really a force to be reckoned with. She was absolutely undeterred by the fact that Giovanni and his son Cosimo came from a minor branch of the Medici family, and she worked tirelessly towards the instatement of Cosimo in some important position in the Florentine government, aiming for the top, for the dukedom, of course, if possible. From a very young age, she sent Cosimo off to be presented at courts in other Italian cities, and she writes tirelessly this continual stream of letters to diplomats and statesmen in Florence and other points abroad. She's continually pressing her son's claim to the dukedom in Florence. So when Lorenzaccio kills off Alessandro in 1536, Cosimo's moment had really arrived.